Hello, everyone. Welcome to our program today on the power of small things in the Roman world. My name is Shelby Brown, and I'm representing the Getty Villa, the Getty's Antiquities Museum. All our talks relate to the ancient world, and today's is on a topic that does not always come up, namely tiny and at least seemingly unimportant Roman things. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today and to help her navigate the Q&A after her talk. Emily Gowers is Professor of Latin Literature at the University of Cambridge, Chair of the Faculty Board of Classics, and Fellow of St. John's College. Her research focuses on many aspects of Roman literature, people, and culture more generally, and she has published dozens of articles, chapters, and books on a fascinating variety of topics, including, as a small example, representations of food and puns about food in Roman literature, why Homer isn't in Virgil's underworld, and the transformation of people into trees in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Among her numerous academic honors and awards, in 2022, Professor Gowers was the Sather Professor at Berkeley, an invited position requiring 4 to 6 public lectures on the classical world to be published later as a book by the University of California Press. Emily was also invited back this year to give another Sather lecture in a greatest hits appearance. The book on her 2022 Sather talk, out this year, is called The Small Stuff of Roman Antiquity, and it inspired this talk today. Emily kindly included a number of Getty antiquities in her presentation. We're putting a link to her book, which has an open access version, into the chat. And now please welcome Emily Gowers. Emily, I turn this over to you.
Thank you, Shelby. Thank you for this lovely introduction. And thank you also to the Getty Villa for inviting me here today and for hosting this event. The book that Shelby's just mentioned is very short. It's also available open access if you don't feel like buying it. But it fulfills a long-standing interest of mine, a lifelong interest, in things small, ordinary, and overlooked, particularly in ancient Rome. I set out wanting to find out why the Romans spent quite so much of their imaginative space and time writing about what looks like completely trivial stuff. Things like household items, garbage, small creatures, small edibles, and so on. And why it is that we find these humdrum encounters so fascinating, or why I do anyway. Small things for me in this book include not just the little objects that you find described in literary texts, but also more abstract things like short biographies, jokes and anecdotes, small worries, and minor feelings of irritation and annoyance. Now, all these things I found in literary sources, not material culture. But the book, as Shelby's just mentioned, is illustrated with plenty of images of ancient objects, and several of them come from the Getty Villa collection. And that's no coincidence when you offer such an amazing and completely free resource for authors and scholars. So thank you for that as well. But even back when I was choosing the photos, I found myself asking, did small textual things and little objects in real life have the same kinds of effects on the ancient Romans? And I also wanted to know, do we, as modern viewers, look at their small things the same way they did? In our case, I think there has to be an extra layer involved. Small ancient things, whether they're real or written, produce in us a powerful illusion of intimate contact with the distant past. Today, I'll be making better use of the objects in the Getty Villa collection, putting them side by side with bits of text, hoping that they can illuminate each other. Now, my sense when I started writing the book was that I was riding some new wave of interest in small things, partly activated by the pandemic, which forced us all up close to the small things in our homes and made us look at them in more attentive ways, and partly by longer-term phenomena like globalization and what I called late capitalist fatigue. I'd noticed a flurry of books and films appearing with the words small and tiny in their titles. Small things like these, the map of tiny, perfect things, the joy of small things, supremely tiny acts, and many more. But what I soon realised was that this current fashion for smallness is just one of many waves historically, many countercultural movements that over the centuries have kept on challenging dominant value systems and knee-jerk reactions that equate large with important and powerful, and small with trivial and powerless. And that people in all eras have enjoyed small things for their own sakes and for what they can do. But first, shut your eyes, and what comes to mind when you think of ancient Rome? You can open them again now. I'm guessing that for many people, it's monuments at the large end of the scale, mind-blowing feats of engineering like the Colosseum or perhaps an aqueduct. Some of us are lucky enough to have had close encounters with monuments like these. I've walked inside the Parthenon in Athens, and I've walked on top of the Pont du Gard aqueduct in France, long before health and safety and pollution were so much of an issue. And in both cases, it was a sublime experience. But find ourselves in a museum, and so often we're drawn to those cases of tiny objects, often plural, often identified only by numbers, jewellery, miniature animals, mysterious metal instruments, locks and keys, and so on. On the right here is a photo I took last summer of a collection of clay turtles and mice, and it's from the Archaeological Museum in Rhodes in Greece. Little things like these set our imaginations spinning. They promise, or they seem to promise, access to the unreachable people who once owned them. We can picture ancient children playing with the animals, smashing them perhaps if they were careless, or squabbling over them. But we don't really know what they were for or who their owners were. Because they're small, little things often get labelled as children's toys. But if you look carefully here, you can see that the turtle at the top has a flat circular disc on its shell, which suggests to me that it was perhaps a cup or a small oil lamp, which if you turned it over, looked like an upside-down turtle. And often, even if we do know what a small object was for, play remains a key element in its composition, a kind of shared in-joke between creator and user. And we'll see some more examples of this later. The group on the left is a fine collection of rings from the Getty Villa. They aren't just pretty. They also remind us how easily some small things can collapse those long-standing equations. Small equals worthless and large equals precious. In both cases, you might be tempted to reach out and touch these little things. But the plucky little survivors are off limits now, behind glass mostly, tantalising and silent. In an exhibition called Islanders, put on in 2023 at my local museum, the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, an exhibition about 6,000 years of settlement and migration in the Mediterranean. By far the most commented on, most photographed item of all was this tiny sculpture of a baby, and I chose it as the first picture in my book. Normally it lives in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, and I'd like to thank that museum for letting me show it again here. Well, doesn't it look exactly like a real-life baby? The sculpture's captured it in all its chubbiness and curiosity as it sets off on its first adventure. But it's made of copper alloy, it's only 2 inches long, and it's 3,000 years old, hidden for all that time in a cave in Crete, waiting for someone to cradle it again in their hand. And I think there are 3 factors that line up to make it so captivating. Its subject, obviously, but also its size and its age. In her now classic book On Longing, which discusses gigantic things, miniature things, and souvenirs as sites of human fantasy, literary critic Susan Stewart has this to say about how we tend to view our childhood, the miniature chapter in all our life histories. She says, we imagine childhood as if it were at the other end of a tunnel, distanced, diminutive, and clearly framed. The fact that this is a model of a baby, and a very small baby at that, and a souvenir from the childhood of the world, adds an extra telescoping dimension to any feelings of nostalgia or enchantment that we already have for this little lost object. A miniature of a real baby, smallest version of humankind, old as the hills and frozen in bronze, but still somehow warm and practically newborn. It sums up everything about our ambiguous relationship to things from the far-off past. On the one hand, positive feelings of recovery and continuity with our remotest origins, but on the other, a strong sense of loss. And it made me wonder if the Romans saw their past in this way, at the other end of a tunnel, distanced, diminutive, and clearly framed. And by their past, I mean both their Roman and or their other national ancestry and their Greek cultural inheritance. And what I found was that even though the Latin word for ancestors is maiores, which literally means bigger or elder people, Roman writers often talk about visiting the childhood homes of past heroes like Cato, Scipio, and the Emperor Augustus, and being struck by just how small and cramped they are. So in some ways, the bigger people, especially when they were children, seemed smaller. As for the Greeks, 1st century BC politician and philosopher Cicero, for one, loves to cut past intellectuals down to size. He gives them little names, calling the philosopher Zeno a clever little old man, and the genius Archimedes a humble little human. It helps him minimize them as academic threats, but it also suggests cozy affection for his fellow eggheads. The small textual details in my book are survivors just as resilient as the Cretan baby. Things you might think utterly insignificant and beneath notice have found their way into the literary record and stuck there like barnacles on a whale. From the very beginning, as I've said, smallness was culturally tied to being trivial, low status, and even worthless. And yet, our very first Greek poems, the epics of Homer, already challenge that equation. Homer loves to include humble, out-of-place similes from the natural, peaceful world before the Trojan War, like this one at the bottom of your screen, of flies buzzing around a pail of milk on a country farm to suggest troops of soldiers or men crowding around a corpse. And that's partly because he's seeing humans from the perspective of the gods. When his goddess Iris peers down from the sky on a Greek army, she says they look to her no bigger than leaves or grains of sand. Which means that thinking of small things as expressive, pugnacious, even threatening, and of large things as reducible, trivial, or sometimes even funny, is also there, right from the earliest times. What varies is the viewer's perspective. Does looking at small things make us into gods as we tower above them? Or do we identify with their helplessness? Or perhaps with their unlikely potential? Think of those Aesop's fables where a mouse outsmarts a lion, an incentive to any social underdog. And the Romans loved to cut the Greek literary canon down to size, especially Homer. One sculptor, as you see here, condensed the plot of his epic poem The Iliad into a set of miniature tablets, which my Cambridge colleague Michael Squire has minutely analysed in his book The Iliad in a Nutshell. And apparently there really was, in Roman times, a miniature version of the Iliad contained in a nutshell. The tablet you can see here isn't quite that small, it's about the size of a pillow. Conversely, the Romans loved to big up small things that had an outsized impact. The kinds of things we celebrate in proverbs like the straw that broke the camel's back, or in fairy tales like The Princess and the Pea. All it took the statesman Cato to prove how close the African enemy Hannibal was to the walls of Rome in the 2nd century BCE was to show his fellow senators a single fig picked in Carthage 3 days earlier and still fresh. The 1st century BCE historian Sallust thought it worth recording how a single explorer in the North African desert during the Roman campaign against King Jugurtha stumbled on a trail of snails, which caused him to go off track, then spy on the enemy camp from a different angle, and eventually change the course of Roman history. Small things could even sometimes be a matter of life and death. The greatest achievement in the career of an imperial courtier called Passienus Crispus was the one-liner he came up with to answer an awkward question from the Emperor Caligula. Have you slept with your own sister? It was well known that the emperor had slept with several of his. The tactful, fence-sitting answer, not yet, which is just one word, nondum, in Latin. This punchline kept him alive a little longer, and it's the thing we most remember about him. I also write in the book about the flick of a switch between life and sudden death, some gloriously random examples of which Pliny lists in his Natural History. They include a Roman who dropped dead when he left a bathhouse sucking an egg and drinking honey wine at the same time. Presumably he choked. Another who died when he stubbed his toe on the doorstep on leaving his house. And even a professor who instantly died of shame because he couldn't answer the student's question. This eccentric list, which is packed with mundane physical objects like eggs and toes, reminds us that small things have another kind of power. They're good for creating an effect of the real, a deceptively reassuring illusion of a full and recognizable world to which we still have access. But why, when the Romans were subjects of a vast Mediterranean empire, did they so often take time to focus on tiny things for their own sake? Not just cheese and eggs, but insects, vermin, seeds, thistledown, nutshells, and other such flimsy, perishable stuff. The 1st century BCE poet Lucretius even writes about atoms, imagining them as a giggling, bustling throng. Why did he think small stuff was worth writing about? In his case, small things sparked his scientific curiosity. They're often invisible to the naked eye or hidden underground. They make up a complete picture of the natural world. But sometimes small things just spark a kind of playfulness, an impulse to do something with the unlikely poetic potential of unpromising stuff, just as we saw that potter playing with the bulbous shape of a turtle. An entire book by 1st century CE poet Martial is devoted to party favours, apophoreta, a Greek word adopted by the Romans which means take-home presents. It's a collection of 2-line disposable tags for gifts exchanged at the Saturnalia, the Roman winter festival. Martial conjures up on the page such things as stationery, cosmetics, and accessories, here earpicks, combs, a tactful nightlight. And you can see here a few that I've chosen for their familiarity to present-day kit. A back scratcher in the shape of a hand, I think we've all seen one of those. And on this page, a bra and earmuffs. It's a lucky dip that switches between luxury and worthless items. But as a whole, this flip book of Roman goods is far more precious and entertaining to us, well, I think so anyway, than some of the tedious multi-volume works by other authors whose sheer size meant that they were more likely to get lost or fragmented. I'm going to single out just one of these poems because there are some nice examples in the Getty Villa collection to match it with. This is a photo of a strigil. It's an implement for scraping off oil and sweat if you were an athlete or an ordinary customer at the baths. So it's a personal care tool like a nail file or a tongue scraper. The Getty has 3 of them in its collection, but I'm drawn to this one because of the wavy pattern that decorates the outer blade. It doesn't seem to serve any ergonomic purpose. The ridges are on the wrong side, the side less in contact with the body. And they're also in the wrong place to steady the part of the tool that's held in the hand. So the detail must be purely decorative. But I can't help thinking it's meant to suggest something about the tool, either the wrinkling effect on the skin produced when rubbing off the oil, or the central inner groove for collecting sweat in, or the human hair between the tool and the skin, or at the very least, and I think this is most likely, it's there to highlight the essential curve of the tool's shape. For us modern viewers, the strigil suggests something additionally seductive, the contours of an invisible human body from the past. And by the way, there's apparently no truth in the popular legend that Roman gladiators used to collect their sweaty scrapings and sell them to the rich women who adored them. But Greek athletes did apparently sell the contents of their strigils for medicinal purposes, but that's a habit that Pliny regards as completely disgusting. You can see that Martial, in his matching poem, also makes the tool's curved shape its key feature. Strigils. These strigils, designed to scrape you with curved metal, come all the way from Pergamon. With less need for towels, you'll put the dry cleaner out of business. Well, it's a trivial enough claim, but these 2 lines can also be made to tell a much more global narrative, one about imperial trade from east to west. Pergamon was in modern-day Turkey, the expansion of consumer choice, and the status symbols that incidentally disrupt a local economy. A strigil is a functional tool, but many small things from antiquity, like the Cretan baby, are representational versions of bigger things. Archaeologists used to write them off as second-class miniatures or mass reproductions. But these days, they appreciate these objects more for the different possibilities that their smallness offered their owners. They were portable, tactile, cute, giftable, souvenir size, playable with, and they could be a focus for private devotion. You could carry around your own personal god. You could squeeze a mascot for good luck in the folds of your toga, as the Emperor Augustus did, a rag of sealskin that he carried around to ward off lightning. You could hide a trinket in its own little box. Small things fostered special, intimate relationships between individuals and the outside world. Take dolls, for example. Often, a Roman girl who died young would be buried with her childhood toys, and this is how a lot of dolls survive. This tomb sculpture of a Roman girl from the Getty Villa collection shows her sprawling on a bed as she might have done in real life, with her feet resting on 2 dolls. The top halves have been quite rubbed away, but you can still see their legs. But what's remarkable, as historian Fanny Delansky's shown, is that Roman girls didn't have baby dolls to train them for future motherhood. They played with more mature female figures, Barbies with elaborate hairstyles, and sometimes jointed, movable bodies, which could be manipulated into all kinds of fantasy scenarios. And their costumes are those of Rome's first ladies, the emperor's wives, who were often powerful figures in their own right. But another scholar, Maurizio Bettini, lets a Roman doll from a teenage girl's burial tug at his heartstrings. He sees it as a forlorn replica of its dead owner, which represents a lost time, her adolescence, that can never return. Seen at the end of a tunnel again. But we have to remember that for their original owners, dolls were passports to an active, aspirational, womanly future. Small things aren't always cute and delightful. So John Mack of the British Museum points out in his book, The Art of Small Things. Discussing the little fetishes and amulets that have been used to ward off pests and evil spirits at all periods of history, he says, small things also get under your skin. They are potent, irritating, sometimes malevolent. The word skin is important here. Sensations provoked by the smallest things can be really intense, like the prick of a needle or an insect's sting. It's almost as if the consistency of small things is super concentrated, sharpening our feelings of pain or tenderness as we contort ourselves into smaller spaces to contain them or protect them or avoid them. Here's a ring that once protected someone from scorpion bites, where the insect's spiky body is imprinted in its surface in a way that's more than a little scary itself. Next to the ring, I put an extract of a letter from philosopher and emperor Marcus Aurelius, 2nd century CE, to his tutor Fronto, recording his heroic escape from a scorpion that invaded his most intimate space, his bed. When I went to lie down, I came upon a scorpion in my bed. However, I was in time to kill it before lying down on it. I mentioned Romans who choke on food and stub their toes, with fatal consequences. But there are plenty more trivial things that absorbed and irritated Roman writers and are easy for us to relate to. Maybe they didn't have pinging phones or junk mail or faulty Wi-Fi connections, but some of their low-level irritants we recognise all too well from our own daily lives. Mosquitoes were just as annoying in the ancient world, so were itchy eyes in a world without antibiotics. In his poem about how to fall out of love, Augustan poet Ovid advises making a list of the tiniest, most irritating tics of the person you're obsessed with, in the hope that one day just one of them might produce what we now call the ick. These annoyances were real enough, but there are actually good social and emotional reasons to communicate them. Uncomfortable encounters, mental and or physical, often at the surface of the skin, help you express something about your relationship to the outside world. Talking about the experience of being even mildly irritated proves either that you can deal with it, you can get it into proportion, or that you have a super sensitive personality, like the princess with the pea. Either way, you can use your feelings to create community and empathy with like-minded fellow sufferers. Another thing whinging about minor feelings allows you to do is to skate over deeper, more painful feelings about bigger things. What Arundhati Roy in her novel The God of Small Things calls the big things, capital B, capital T, that lurk unsaid. So when Cicero keeps oversharing about his sore eyes in his letters to his absent friend Atticus, he's not just trying to cement the intimate connection that comes from talking about your bodily functions to another person. He's also turning a blind eye, quite literally, to larger, less manageable pains, like the crisis in government at Rome, the rise of Julius Caesar, and his own political obliteration. Occasionally, though, a feeling is just too small and personal to share with anyone else. The story goes that one Roman husband decided out of the blue to divorce his lovely wife, and no one could understand why, until he told them, "Only I can feel where the small stone in my shoe hurts my foot." My favourite small object from the Getty Villa collection sums up some of the contradictions in small things that we've seen so far, especially the way that they can combine cuteness with menace. This bronze mouse, with its compact, curled-up little body, could well put us in mind of Japanese Netsuke. Desirable aesthetic objects now, but originally functional devices as wooden and ivory toggles to fasten clothing. Here's one from the Viennese collection, made famous by English potter and writer Edmund de Waal. who describes inheriting the little figures in his book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, and picking one of them up as a moment of seduction, an encounter between a hand and an object that is electric. As with many Roman things, the object's smallness was their salvation. When the Nazis removed the family art, these little things survived only because a maid first stowed them in her apron, then hid them in her mattress. But how to interpret a Roman mouse, which comes from such a different cultural context? At first glance, I guess it was a child's toy, or more likely, an adult's precious ornament. But it turns out that originally Roman bronze mice were always part of something else. They were ornamental add-ons to functional household or temple implements, soldered onto cutlery, attached to hanging lights via rings, stuck onto candelabra, oil lamps, and even wind chimes. And it was only later that the metal bits were filed off so the mice could be sold in modern markets as cute freestanding antiquities. Probably because they're nocturnal animals, there was always an association between mice and lamps. In the Greek parody of Homer's Iliad called The Battle of Frogs and Mice, the goddess Athena refuses to side with the mice because she says they damage her garlands and plunder her lamps to choose the wicks and slurp the oil. Which explains exactly why you often find mouse figures perched on the edge of lamps. Pesky mice were often credited with humanoid intelligence. According to one Greek natural historian, teams of mice were clever enough to form a kind of daisy chain with their mouths and tails to hoist up fellow mice that had fallen into storage jars. In Rome, mice were depicted as little lords of the world, as gladiators, senators holding scrolls, and even outweighing elephants in scale pans. And you can see in this mouse trumpeter from the British Museum something of the chutzpah of his modern equivalents, Mickey Mouse and Jerry of Tom and Jerry fame. So even if bronze mice were just decorative add-ons to larger items, they were conceived in ways that wittily aligned them with their habitats and made them the heroes of the hour. Unlike the Cretan baby sculpture, the Getty mouse is the same size as a real mouse, and that gives it an extra kind of power. For just a moment, you might mistake it for the real thing, like this one on the famous Roman mosaic of leavings from a dinner table called the Unswept Floor. And although our mouse looks silky and sweet enough, its mood is hard to read. It's coiled up like a spring. Its energy is conserved. You might have hidden it in your hand and suddenly revealed it to scare a child. You might have shrieked if you'd seen it swinging from your chandelier or perched on the edge of your lamp. And look at the mouse's hands. They're concealing something, probably a nut or a crumb, as if it's been scavenging. But the gesture perhaps also invites us to handle it in the same way, to cradle its polished body and peer into its inner folds. Bronze is of course all wrong as material for a mouse's soft, furry body. As an artist, Edmond de Waal's very attuned to the game that Japanese sculptors play with material and subject. He writes about one netsuke depicting a medlar, a very squishy fruit, which he used to carry in his pocket when researching his book. "I love it," he said, "making something to hold out of a very hard material that feels so soft is a slow and rather good tactile pun." And presumably his pocket stayed dry. The 1st century BCE poet Virgil includes a mouse in an episode of his agricultural poem The Georgics, and here he shows just how alert he is to the cuteness and menace that small creatures combine. His tiny mouse, exiguus mus in Latin, pops up in a list of other tiny pests that invade granaries and mock the farmers whose crops they so easily plunder. Then all the different pests make fun of you, Often a tiny mouse sets up house and builds its granaries beneath the earth, and partially sighted moles dig their chambers there. A toad turns up in the cracks, and all the many monsters that the earth produces. And the weevil and the ant, fearful of an impoverished old age, plunder a huge heap of corn. The animals are familiarized for us as miniature human parasites. Miniature humans, parasites, misers, hermits, and thrifty housekeepers. But however tiny, a mouse could be scary and out of control. It was scurried about and was hard to see whether it was part of a mass plague of mice or the lone hero of an Aesop fable. Virgil calls the pests pestes, which can also mean plagues, and monsters, monstra, a word usually applied to much bigger terrors. Conversely, though, seeing your problems as mouse-sized was a way to soften the terrors of the world and put them into perspective. Cicero once faced potential disaster as a landlord when 2 of the shops he owned collapsed so badly that, as he says, not only the tenants, but even the mice have moved elsewhere. But just thinking of mice inspires him to minimize his problems philosophically. Other people, he goes on, call this a calamity. I don't even call it a nuisance. So small things can also help you get things in perspective. Inspired by the mouse and its folded body, the last thing about small things that I want to mention very briefly is their connection with ideas of intimate containment. The last chapter in my book is about Latin diminutive words. Words like, for example, Caligula, an emperor's nickname that means bootykins, from the fact that he was raised in an army camp from a toddler. Or musculus, which comes to mean a muscle in your arm, or a mussel from the sea, but originally meant little mouse. Or scrupulous, a little stone, the kind you might find in your shoe, from which we get our word scruple, a small nagging sensation. Or parvulus, the diminutive of parvus, itself the word for small. All these long words seem to be trying to squeeze out meaning, a bit like our teeny tiny or itsy bitsy, as if language is straining towards some perfect endpoint or inmost centre, like the point of a needle, or infinite sets of interlocking boxes. By a nice coincidence, 1st century BCE Roman writer Varro's Guide to the Latin Language uses 3 words for boxes to illustrate how diminutives work, getting more and more elaborate the smaller they get. So we start with kista, a box, move to kistula, a boxlet, and then end up with kistella, a tiny boxlet. And for this reason, diminutives have strong psychological links to human feelings about intimacy, a word that comes from the Latin for innermost. They can help us understand our feelings about wanting to put large things into smaller boxes, like putting Homer's Iliad in a nutshell, or getting a handle on small things, like fondling a bronze mouse, or about being containers ourselves, with hidden interiors that we might or might not be prepared to expose. And in the book I explore how some Roman poets used boxes, baskets, and so on as surrogates for their own secret parts. I'm going to end with 2 more gift tags from Marshall. This time they're labels for boxes. One's of ivory, the luxurious version, and one of wood, the cheap version. And I've put them next to a wooden Egyptian jewellery box, which isn't in the Getty and is much older than Rome, but I like it because it's such a puzzle of interlocking folds and partitions. When he presents us with a cheap wooden box, Marshall warns us that when we get to the bottom, there might be nothing there. But never mind, he says, at least you've got the box, the word for which is loculus, another diminutive word from locus, meaning a place or space. So we may never get to the bottom of small things from the past or find the key to their inmost meaning. But that may be exactly why they fascinate us so much, because they keep on puzzling and intriguing us with the secrets they hold. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Emily. We have a number of questions. We'll take as many as we can. The first one I'll pose to you is a universal one. Maria says, I love this talk and for the link it gives me to the past. The little mouse is so incredibly charming, and someone thousands of years ago thought so too. Is there something universal in this connection to these small things?
Thank you, Maria, for that question. I'm absolutely sure that you're right about this. I'm sure the Greeks love their small things, and French people love their small things. And one thing that I discovered when I was trying to find out about diminutive words is an article that I read by someone called Daniel Jurafsky, which posited that there is a counter-cultural and universal association between diminutive words and the concept of a child. And that's quite clever because it helps you understand why sometimes, oh, that humble little man, as Cicero said of Archimedes, it's very patronizing. It's also kind of affectionate, kind of tender. You're one of us. You're just a smaller version of us, and so on. So I have no doubt that I work on ancient Rome, but there's all kinds of work going on about small things in other cultures. It is, despite what Shelby said at the beginning, it's actually a really popular field at the moment. So I'm the last to the table, really. Thank you.
I wonder how many, interesting. So do you think that the general public is very aware of this, of or ancient small things?
Well, only if they go to museums
Only
or
if they
they read
read
Getty
the academic literature.
academic literature. No, I think what I found when I mentioned, the books and films that are coming out at the moment is that this has permeated into popular culture. It's something in the zeitgeist that the pandemic made us all focus, in this very myopic way on the objects directly in front of us. So uh, um, it's something in the air very much, and it's not just in academia. I mean, the academics can kind of wrestle about it and try to think of the reasons and see, great fashions in the social sciences for looking up close at small things and not being so interested in big data. So I talk a little bit in my introduction about the sort of standoff between the micro people and the macro people in academia. But yes, it permeates much wider than that, I'm sure about that. Yeah.
Well, there are lots of questions here that indicate people want explanations about Romans and why.
Well, try me. Yeah.
The way we also are doing that, apparently, more than I know. Um, Here's a question that asks, it's interesting that Romans use diminutives to trivialize in a bad and a good way, as we do. Is there a generalization you can make about whether the trivial is mostly for good or negative aims?
Wow. Okay. Well, the first chapter of my book, punning on that novel I mentioned earlier, is the good of small things. So, yeah, I'm a fan of small things. They usually lack ego unless they're, Jerry of Tom and Jerry, or one of those Roman fun mice. Um, I talk at the end of my book about that fly that somehow got into the um, vice presidential debates and settled on Mike Pence's head and kind of cut him down to size. or that episode of Breaking Bad that is, I think, called The Fly, and is just about a kind of existential episode where a fly gets into the room and kind of sucks all the oxygen out of it. I'm starting now to make a case for small things having a great deal of ego and wanting a lot of attention, and there is, of course, that side to them as well. Yeah.
In your teaching, have you noticed students' perceptions of Rome change after they have focused on small rather than epic matters?
Well, that is a really good question. If I got to choose what I wanted to teach, I would be focusing on the small and the humble and those kind of quotidian things all the time. But, I lecture on Virgil's Aeneid. Talking of diminutives, the Aeneid is famous for having just one true diminutive in it. And it's no coincidence that it comes in the book about Aeneas's romance with Queen Dido, which all ended very badly when he leaves her. But she wishes that she had a little Aeneas, and she calls it a parvulus Aeneas. She wishes she had a little souvenir of him, i.e., a baby, which she never, in fact, has to remember him by. So you can find the small in the large. Virgil, like Homer, is full of similes of bees and ants. So in any big epic, you are going to find right from the beginning, whether it's Homer or Virgil or Ovid's Metamorphoses or Lucretius's on the nature of everything, you're going to find small things because they give a complete version of the world. Pliny, in his natural history, is a little bit mean to the very smallest of insects. He makes an excellent case for why he needs to include insects in the natural history. He says they are, you wouldn't believe when you get close to them. Of course, no microscopes in those days, but when you get close to them, how intricate and sophisticated their little bodies are. The creator must have been interested in insects. And then in the next breath, he says, oh, but there are these microbes which are just too small to be included. So you have to draw the line somewhere in a book about everything.
There are a couple of questions about the function of dolls or small
Yes.
aspirational sorts of objects.
Yeah.
And here's one question about other examples you might be able to give for aspirational miniatures, either for children and adults. And someone also asked about, are there aspirational models like that for boys?
Really good question. In the book, and this is how much we're talking about zeitgeist and a mood in the air. I start the book by talking about a blog that was done for the Society of Classical Studies, when Nandini Pandey collected together a lot of classicists, and she asked them what single thing would they like to preserve from the ancient world? What would they like to keep from the burning house of antiquity if they could have just one thing? And so many of them chose little things. It was really striking. Little things or domestic things. And this was during the pandemic. And I remember that one academic chose a little wooden horse on wheels, very, very old, from ancient Greece. And he said it's a very democratic object because you don't know whether it belonged to a king's son or a slave's son. But, it was for some little boy who dreamt of going to war and having his own chariot one day. So that's an example that comes immediately to mind. Yes, I can see someone in the comments is talking about little gladiatorial chariots. Yes, that's right.
There's a question also about objects like doll houses. So miniatures
Yes.
to put miniatures in a sense.
Yes. Well, I don't know if that questioner knows more about it than I do, But actually, earlier today, I was thinking, I don't know of any doll houses. And I was thinking, when did they begin? I mean, you think of those Dutch ones from the 17th century. Um, I do know that one retired Roman statesman, his hobby was bees, and he made for himself a transparent beehive. It was made of horn, carved very, very finely so that you could see the bees operating safely behind this layer. That's not a dollhouse. The poet Statius describes a parrot and the really beautiful dollhouse-like cage parrot lived in, which is, all gilded and covered in red paint, but is a kind of little prison for that bird. But actual doll houses, I don't know anything about. I'd be really happy to be enlightened. Do you know of any, Shelby, in the Getty
I
Villa?
can't think of any that are like anything like what we do, where we create worlds for kids or adults to live in.
Yeah.
No.
Yes.
I can think of outdoor scenes where you have on pots or in imagery people engaging in agriculture or things like that, but a whole house, that's a good one. Good question.
Yeah,
Now
it's a
we
good.
have to go do more research.
Yes.
But there's a question which I don't think is fair to you. It's about whether or not artisans of small things have magnifying glasses. As far as we know, they do not. But have you read anything that illuminates uh, craft approaches to small things that you can speak
Well,
to?
well, I guess that's a really good question. Who made that legendary Iliad in a nutshell, if they didn't have some kind of special lens to use? I remember my father bringing me back from India a tiny wooden egg, and inside it were tiny little elephants, each one smaller than the other until the last one was almost like a little seed. But of course, they would have had special eyeglasses. A comment flashed by just then, it's disappeared, about Egyptian houses. And I've been thinking that as well, because things, tend to be better preserved in Egypt. And in fact, in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, I remember as a child seeing Egyptian models of people rowing boats, not miniature, but about this big with little people in them rowing away. Um,
And it helps that in Egypt, people are making small houses and replicas of real life to go into tombs, which
exactly.
encourages it in a way that apparently Romans didn't.
Yes.
They
Yes.
didn't want that necessarily in their tombs.
Yes. Well, yeah. Thank you for mentioning that, because I was thinking, well, they're not really toys, and they are preserved in tombs.
Here's an interesting question that I think we could all benefit from. Could you elaborate on Ovid's useful list of small, irritating things we can think of to fall out of love?
Um, oh, I wish I could, but I think there's a passage I'm thinking of. He doesn't actually specify. He said it's just like piling up a huge heap, and all these little things, add up to a kind of tsunami of unpleasant features. But he does give advice, like go round to your girlfriend's house in the morning before she's cleaned her teeth or brushed her hair. So I think the Romans definitely had the idea of the ick. And the thing about Ovid is, you know, he kind of loves women, but his power over them is that uh, he knows their wiles. And one delightful fragmentary poem by him is all about cosmetics. It's just a description of all the little pots and potions on a Roman lady's dressing table and what, how she creates the seductive persona that will ruin your life. So he tells us what he knows from behind the scenes.
There's a very long quote from Fegel's Iliad um, about Trojans passing troops upon troops, Apollo with his aegis leading them, book 15. And the comment is, yet again, we see the interplay of innocence and destruction and witness the impetuous actions of gods compared to the unthinking violence of children. And that leads to a big question about how is childhood valued. It says in the ancient Mediterranean, let's just stick with Romans for your sake. How would you
How is
respond to that?
childhood valued? Is that connected? With the
Well,
god Apollo?
are kids allowed to be kids is the final
Oh,
question, which I think is a modern question.
of course, kids are allowed to be kids. Um, sometimes in sinister ways. You could be somebody else's pet kid for the whole of your life. The Romans had a word delicii, which kind of meant a toy boy, as well as a toy. So you could be a human toy for someone else. The other thing is that adults were allowed to be kids as well. So some of these artsy little poems are called paignia, which means toys or childish things. So what I was suggesting earlier is that when the Romans come into contact with these small things, they start kind of putting on their childlike hats in the way they describe them. They have fun with them. So yeah, they're pretty fun-loving people, the Romans, however severe you might think they are.
There's a question that wonders whether there's a counterpart in the big things of Rome.
Yes. Well, yes, in that the small things are, I think, always a kind of thorn in the side, a point of the needle, a pricking of the balloon of all these larger pretensions. So the small things tend to be a reaction, often to pomposity, to bombast, to monumentality, if that answers the question.
I think we're running out of time, but let's do two more questions.
Okay.
One is, are there any specific moments in the past when small objects become popular, sort of the way they have for us? And what was similar about that time with ours, if so?
That's really interesting. Something I mentioned briefly in the book is a concept that was very popular in the 18th century, and it was either called little lives or it narratives. And the concept was that you took a small object, like, for example, a penny or sometimes a rupee, and you told its life story as it went the rounds of all the different hands that it fell into. So small things were very big in the 18th century. So that's one moment. I also talk about Virginia Woolf, so that's 20th century, as a great friend to small things. Somebody who brings us closer to a kind of microscopic focus in some of her very long novels, or writes a novel about one day in the life of someone, which is a concept that many people, from Seneca to Nicholas and Baker, have indulged in. So I think the answer is I can't really think of a time when small things didn't appeal to some people.
The last question gets into class and differences
Okay.
in Small Things by Class,
Yes.
because Cicero's downplaying of his shop's collapse also downplays his tenants and the value of their lives. Do you find many examples that show that the small things are very different for different classes of Romans?
That's a lovely final question, and it's an important one. Um, what comes into my head is a very long poem by the satirist Juvenal, which is one of, among other things, it's one of the most xenophobic, anti-immigrant poems in ancient literature. But it does have one very pathetic scene of an ordinary man who lives in one of these rickety tower blocks in Rome, which were called insulae, islands, and a fire breaks out, and he escapes with nothing. But we just get this very poignant memory of his little mantelpiece in his house, which has got various kind of trinkets on it, and Juvenal bothers to tell us what the trinkets were. Um, so I'll leave you with that. Go away and read
That's a nice
free.
ending.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Emily, I want to thank you so much for sharing your perspective on small things and for including our collection into your world of small things. Thanks to our audience for all your questions. And remember to look for our programs on. Remember that we will be opening again June 27, and we hope to see you soon at another program. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.